Alice and Bob were best friends since kindergarten. They liked to do everything together, from playing games to reading books. They also enjoyed going to the park every weekend, where they would ride their bikes, have a picnic, and watch the birds. One day, they decided to go to the park as usual. But when they got there, they saw that there was a big sign that said, "Closed for renovation." Alice was disappointed and said, "Oh no, what are we going to do now?" Bob shrugged and said, "We can go somewhere else. How about the library? We can read some new books there." Alice shook her head and said, "No, I don't want to go to the library. It's boring and quiet. I want to go to the park." Bob sighed and said, "But we can't go to the park. It's closed. Don't you see the sign?" Alice nodded and said, "I see it, but I don't care. I want to go to the park anyway." Bob was surprised and said, "What? You can't do that. That's breaking the rules. We'll get in trouble if we do that." Alice rolled her eyes and said, "Who cares? It's not like anyone is watching. Come on, let's go." She grabbed her bike and started to pedal towards the gate of the park. Bob followed her reluctantly and said, "Alice, wait. This is a bad idea. Please stop." Alice ignored him and said, "Don't be such a chicken. It'll be fun. Trust me." She reached the gate and saw that it was locked with a chain and a padlock. She looked around and saw a pair of bolt cutters lying on the ground. She picked them up and said, "Look, someone left these here. How convenient." She used the bolt cutters to cut the chain and opened the gate. She smiled and said, "See? Nothing to it. Let's go in." She pushed her bike through the gate and entered the park. Bob had clearly taken issue with Alice's behavior and said, "Alice, this is wrong. We shouldn't be here. Let's go back." Alice shook her head and said, "No way. We're here now. Let's have some fun." Bob shrugged and said, "Maybe because it's winter, or maybe because they're renovating it." Alice nodded and said, "Maybe, but it's still creepy." She looked around and saw a pond in the distance. She pointed at it and said, "Hey, look over there. There's a pond. Let's go check it out." She rode her bike towards the pond and Bob followed her. They reached the pond and saw that it was frozen over with a thin layer of ice. Alice smiled and said, "Wow, look at that. The pond is frozen." Bob nodded and said, "Yeah, it is." Alice got off her bike and walked towards the edge of the pond. She touched the ice with her hand and said, "It feels cold." Bob got off his bike too and walked towards her. He said, "Be careful, Alice. The ice might break." Alice laughed and said, "Don't worry, Bob. It won't break. It's strong enough to hold us." She stepped onto the ice and started to slide on it with her shoes. Bob watched her nervously and said, "Alice, please come back. This is dangerous." Alice ignored him again and said, "No way. This is fun." She slid across the ice and reached the other side of the pond. She turned around and waved at Bob. She shouted, "Come on, Bob. Join me. It's awesome." Bob shook his head and shouted back, "No, Alice, I'm not coming. It's too risky." He tried to get through to her, but she wouldn't listen. He wished she would give in to his reasoning, but she was too stubborn. He wondered why she had to take issue with him when they usually agreed on everything. He missed the old Alice, who was sensible and cautious. He didn't like the new Alice, who was reckless and defiant. He hoped she would come to her senses soon and get out of the park before they got caught. He also hoped he would get something out of this experience, like a lesson or a memory. But he doubted it would be anything good. He decided to get together with some other friends who were more responsible and fun. He left his bike behind and walked away from the pond. He hoped Alice would follow him soon, but he didn't look back. As he was leaving the park, he saw a police car parked outside the gate. He realized that someone had seen them and reported them. He felt a surge of fear and regret. He wondered how he could get out of this mess and avoid punishment. He wished he had never followed Alice into the park.